In the soft green folds of the English countryside, where the River Aldwyn curled like a silver ribbon between the hills, there stood a small village called Hollow Bridge. It was the kind of place where chimney smoke rose in lazy spirals every morning, where sheep grazed on the slopes above the church, and where everybody knew everybody else's business, for better or for worse. At the edge of this village, past the baker's shop and the old stone well, stood a crooked little cottage covered in ivy. Its roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and its garden grew more weeds than vegetables. This was Willow Cottage, and it was home to a girl named Poppy Hartley. Poppy was 12 years old, with unruly brown curls that refused to be tamed by any ribbon, and eyes the color of strong tea. She was not rich. In fact, by the standards of Hollow Bridge, she was quite poor. Her father had died 3 winters ago in a fall from the old mill roof, and her mother, Mrs. Hartley, took in mending and laundry from the wealthier families in the village to keep food on the table. But though Poppy's stomach was often empty, her heart never was. She was the sort of girl who would share her last crust of bread with a hungry dog, who would walk an old woman's shopping basket home even when her own arms ached from carrying firewood all morning, who would sit beside a crying child at the village fete and not leave until the tears had dried. "You have a soft heart, Poppy," her mother often said, brushing the curls from her daughter's forehead. "Softer than is wise, perhaps, in a hard world." "Is it wrong to be soft, Mama?" Poppy would ask. "No, my love," her mother would reply. "It is only dangerous. There are those in this world who mistake softness for weakness and try to take advantage of it. But never let them turn you hard. A hard heart is a heavier thing to carry than an empty purse." Poppy did not fully understand these words yet, but she would come to understand them very soon, in ways she could not have imagined. Every day, after her chores were finished, Poppy would walk along the riverbank to gather watercress and blackberries, which she sold at the market for a few pennies. It was on one such ordinary afternoon, with the September sun slanting gold through the willow trees, that her life began to change. She noticed an old woman sitting on a fallen log by the water, her clothes travel-worn and dusty, her feet bare and blistered. The woman's gray hair was tangled, and she looked as though she had walked a very long way indeed. Most of the village children hurried past such strangers. Their parents had warned them about vagabonds and tinkers who came through with the autumn fairs, some honest, some not. But Poppy stopped. "Are you all right?" she asked. The old woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were a strange, pale gray, like morning mist. "I have walked far, child, and I have nothing left. No food, no coin, and my feet have carried me as far as they can." Poppy did not hesitate. She opened the little cloth bag at her waist, where she had gathered a handful of blackberries meant for market, meant to become the pennies that would buy her family's bread that week, and held them out. "Here," she said. "It isn't much, but it's sweet, and it will give you strength." The old woman stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing something invisible. "You would give away your family's supper for a stranger?" "My mother says a hard heart is heavier to carry than an empty purse," Poppy said. "Besides, you look like you need it more than we do today." The old woman's face softened into something that was almost a smile, though her eyes remained strange and searching. She took the blackberries and ate them slowly, as though savoring a feast. "Sit with me a while, child," she said. "An old woman grows lonely on long roads." So Poppy sat and they talked about the village, about the harvest, about small and unimportant things, until the sun began to dip low over the hills. When at last Poppy rose to go home, worried her mother would fret, the old woman caught her wrist gently. "You have shown me a kindness today that many would not have shown," she said. "Kindness such as yours is rare, and rare things deserve to be rewarded." From within her tattered shawl, she drew out a small brass lantern. It was no larger than an apple, its metal tarnished with age, etched with strange, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when Poppy looked at them directly. "Take this," the old woman said. "It is called the Lantern of Truth. It has been passed from hand to hand for longer than this village has stood, always finding its way to someone whose heart is generous enough to carry it. Light it, and it will show you what is true, the true nature of things, the true hearts of people, the true path when you are lost. But heed this warning, Poppy Hartley. The lantern's light reveals truth to the one who holds it, not power over others. Use it to see clearly, never to control. And know this too, the lantern does not simply give. It also asks. In time, it will ask something of you, and how you answer will determine whether it remains a blessing or becomes a burden. Poppy blinked in astonishment. How do you know my name? I never told you. But when she looked up, the log where the old woman had been sitting was empty. There was no sign of her on the riverbank, no footprints in the soft mud, no rustle of her passing through the reeds. She had vanished as completely as morning mist beneath the climbing sun. Poppy looked down at the small brass lantern in her hands, her heart pounding with wonder and a touch of fear. Slowly, she tucked it into her bag beside the last of her blackberries and hurried home through the gathering dusk. That night, after her mother had gone to bed and the cottage had settled into silence, Poppy sat at the small wooden table by the dying embers of the fire and drew the lantern from her bag. It was heavier than it looked, and cold to the touch despite having been carried close to her body all evening. She turned it over in her hands, studying the strange spiral patterns, wondering if the old woman had simply been a dotty traveler playing a trick on a foolish girl. There was no candle inside it that she could see, no wick, no oil. And yet, when she murmured, almost to herself, "I wish I could see," the lantern flared to life with a soft golden glow that had no visible source. Poppy gasped and nearly dropped it. The light was warm, gentle, like captured sunlight, and as it filled the small kitchen, something extraordinary happened. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to peel back, and for just a moment, Poppy could see, truly see, the small, ordinary things around her as if for the first time. She saw the worn groove in the table where her father used to rest his elbow while he told her stories. She saw the careful, loving stitches in the quilt on her bed, sewn by her mother's tired hands late into countless nights. She saw, somehow, the truth of the love that had built this humble little cottage, layer upon layer, kindness upon kindness. Tears welled in her eyes, though she could not entirely say why. The lantern did not show her gold or jewels or grand visions. It showed her what was already there, illuminated with a clarity she had never possessed before. She blew out the light, for somehow she knew that a soft breath would extinguish it, just as a soft breath had once been enough to light it, and sat in the darkness a long while, thinking. Over the following days, Poppy began to understand the lantern's power more fully. When she held it near her mother, who came home exhausted and worried after a long day of scrubbing other people's linens, the light revealed not just tiredness, but a deep well of love and quiet strength that Poppy had never fully appreciated. When she held it near the baker, Mr. Whitfield, who always seemed gruff and short-tempered, the light revealed grief, for his wife had died the previous spring, and his sharpness was armor over sorrow, not cruelty. The lantern did not lie, and it did not flatter. It simply showed. And Poppy began to see the village of Hollow Bridge and the people in it with new and tender eyes. But not everyone's truth was gentle. There was a boy in the village named Edmund Pratt, the son of the wealthiest family in Hollow Bridge. His father owned the mill, the largest farm, and half the cottages that the poorer villagers rented. Edmund was a year older than Poppy, tall and handsome, always dressed in fine wool coats while other children wore patched hand-me-downs. Edmund had never been kind to Poppy. He called her ragamuffin and beggar girl in front of the other children, and once, when she was younger, he had knocked a basket of eggs from her hands simply because he found her stumbling and scrambling to catch them amusing. One afternoon, at the village green where the children gathered to play after their chores, Edmund spotted the small brass lantern peeking from Poppy's bag. "What's that ugly old thing?" he sneered, snatching it before she could stop him. "Looks like something dug out of a rubbish heap. Fitting for a ragamuffin like you." "Please give it back," Poppy said, reaching for it. "It's not a toy." But Edmund, delighted to have found something that mattered to her, held it out of reach, turning it over with mocking curiosity. "What does it do, then? Does it turn straw into gold? Perhaps that's how your family will finally afford proper shoes." The other children laughed. Not because they found it truly funny, but because they were afraid of Edmund, and laughing with him was safer than standing beside Poppy. In his careless turning of the lantern, Edmund's thumb brushed against a small ridge along its base, and quite by accident, the lantern flared to life in his hands. The golden light spilled across the village green, and for a moment, everyone froze. But where the light had shown poppy warmth and hidden goodness in the hearts of the villagers, in Edmund's hands it revealed something different, a shadow, coiled and tight, of fear disguised as arrogance. The light showed, faintly but unmistakably, an image only Poppy could truly perceive, a small boy sitting alone in a grand, cold house, being told again and again by a stern father that kindness was weakness, that only strength and wealth commanded respect, that tears were for the poor and the foolish. Edmund cried out and dropped the lantern as though it had burned him, though it had not. His face had gone pale. What was that?" he stammered, all his mockery gone. Poppy picked up the lantern gently and blew out its light. She did not fully understand everything the vision had shown her, but she understood enough. Edmund's cruelty was not simple meanness. It was a wound, wrapped in fine wool coats and expensive boots, trying to look like strength. "It shows the truth," she said quietly. "Not to hurt you, just to show." Edmund's face twisted, embarrassment fighting with something rawer beneath it. "I don't know what trick that was, but I don't want to see it again," he snapped, and stormed off across the green, the other children trailing uncertainly after him. But Poppy noticed, in the days that followed, that Edmund watched her from a distance more than he mocked her outright. Something in him had shifted, even if he did not yet know what to do with that shift. Word travels quickly in small villages, and though Poppy told no one directly about the lantern's true nature, whispers began to spread. A magical light. A lantern that shows secrets. Some said it could find lost treasure. Others said it could read a person's fortune. By the time the rumors reached the ears of a traveling merchant named Silas Grimshaw, who arrived in Hollow Bridge with his cart of trinkets and tonics for the autumn fair, the stories had grown wild and strange indeed. Silas Grimshaw was a clever, oily sort of man, with a wax mustache and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had made his fortune, such as it was, by buying curious objects cheaply from unsuspecting country folk and selling them at enormous profit to wealthy collectors in London. He found Poppy at the market, selling watercress from her basket, and crouched down to speak to her at eye level, his voice syrupy sweet. "I hear tell, little miss, that you possess a most remarkable lantern," he said. "A magical thing, they say. Now, I don't put much stock in village gossip, of course, but I am a collector of curiosities, and I'd be willing to pay a very handsome sum for such an item. Say, 20 gold sovereigns." Poppy's breath caught. 20 gold sovereigns was more money than her family had seen in years, more than her mother could earn from a whole year of mending and laundry. With that money, they could fix the sagging roof, buy new boots for winter, perhaps even purchase the cottage outright instead of renting it from Edmund's father. The temptation was enormous. She thought of her mother's tired eyes, of the cold drafts that crept through the cottage walls each winter, of the way her own stomach sometimes growled itself to sleep. She hesitated. "I would need to think on it." Of course, Grimshaw said smoothly. "Take your time. I shall be in the village until market day's end. But do consider, my dear, an old trinket is no use to a poor family. Gold can buy bread and boots and warm blankets. What good is truth to a girl with an empty belly?" He left her with those words ringing in her ears, and Poppy walked home that evening turning the question over and over in her mind. That night, she lit the lantern once more, alone in the kitchen, and this time she asked it a different kind of question, not to see someone else's truth, but her own. "Should I sell you?" she whispered. "We need the money, so badly." The lantern's light did not answer in words. Instead, it showed her a vision, soft and shifting like a dream. She saw herself, older, wealthy perhaps, but standing alone in a grand house much like the one she had glimpsed in Edmund's memory, cold, distant, empty of the warmth that filled Willow Cottage despite its crooked roof and empty larder. She saw her mother's face, not angry, but sad, as though something precious and irreplaceable had been given away for a price that could never truly be paid back. Poppy blew out the light, her decision made, though her heart still ached with the weight of what she was choosing to give up. The next morning, she found Silas Grimshaw packing his cart to leave the village.
"I've decided," she said.
"I won't sell the lantern. Not for 20 sovereigns, not for 100. Grimshaw's smile flickered, showing for just a moment the greed beneath his charm. "A pity," he said coldly. "Foolish, too. Gold is a truth that never needs a lantern to prove it, little girl. You'll regret this choice when winter comes and your belly is empty again." He climbed onto his cart and drove away, and Poppy stood watching him go, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Autumn deepened into a season of heavy rains. The river Aldwyn, usually gentle and slow, swelled with water rushing down from the hills, turning brown and violent, eating away at its banks day by day. One night, the rain came harder than anyone in Hollowbridge could remember. Thunder cracked over the hills, and by midnight, the river had broken its banks entirely, sending a wall of muddy water surging toward the lower part of the village, where the poorest cottages, including Willow Cottage, stood closest to the water's edge. Poppy woke to the sound of her mother's frightened cry and the horrible rushing noise of water already lapping at the cottage door. They fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs, Poppy clutching the lantern instinctively to her chest, and stumbled through ankle-deep water toward higher ground, joining a stream of other terrified villagers doing the same. By dawn, the rain had eased, but the damage was done. Willow Cottage, along with a dozen others in the low part of the village, stood flooded to the windowsills, mud and debris scattered everywhere the water had touched. Families huddled together on the village green, shivering, having lost nearly everything. It was in this moment of chaos and grief that the lantern's true purpose revealed itself. Poppy, standing amid the wreckage with her exhausted, weeping mother, lit the lantern, not out of curiosity this time, but out of desperate need. "Please," she whispered, "show me what to do." The light flared, but this time it did not show her private truths of hearts and hidden sorrows. Instead, it seemed to illuminate something more practical, more urgent, as though the lantern understood that truth was not always about feelings, but sometimes about clarity in crisis. Poppy found herself suddenly recalling, with unusual sharpness, that the old chapel on the hill, long abandoned, its roof still sound, could shelter many families through the coming days. She remembered that Mrs. Fenwick, 3 cottages up, kept a large store of preserved food in her cellar, untouched by the flood, and would surely share it if asked directly rather than left to offer on her own amid the chaos. She recalled, too, that the miller's storeroom, high on the hill and dry, held blankets and sacks that could be repurposed. It was not magic exactly. The lantern showed her nothing supernatural in this moment. It simply cleared away her panic and grief long enough for her practical 12-year-old mind to remember what she already, somewhere, knew. Sometimes truth is not a grand revelation, but simply the clarity to see the help that is already within reach. Poppy ran to the chapel first, rousing the old caretaker, and then to Mrs. Fenwick's cellar, and then up the hill to the mill. The mill, Edmund's father's mill. She hesitated at the gate, remembering Edmund's cruelty, remembering the coldness of his household that the lantern had once shown her. But there was no time for old grudges. Children were shivering on the village green. She pounded on the door. It was Edmund himself who answered, bleary-eyed and startled. "Poppy? What?" "The village is flooded," she said breathlessly. "Families have lost everything. Your father's storeroom has blankets, dry sacks, supplies.
Please.
People need help." For a moment, old habits flickered across Edmund's face, the instinct to sneer, to dismiss her as beneath his concern. But something else was there too, something that had perhaps been growing quietly since the day the lantern showed him his own hidden wound. He looked past her, down the hill, at the distant huddle of shivering, muddy villagers on the green. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the house. Moments later, he returned, not alone, but with his father, Mr. Pratt, roused from sleep and irritable, until he too saw the scale of the disaster below. To Poppy's astonishment, Edmund did not simply hand over supplies and retreat to his warm, dry house. He worked alongside her and the other villagers through the gray morning, carrying blankets and sacks of grain down the muddy hill, his fine wool coat soon as filthy and soaked as anyone else's. "Why are you helping?" Poppy asked him quietly as they set down a load of blankets at the chapel door. Edmund did not answer immediately. He looked down at his mud-streaked hands as though seeing them for the first time. "That light you showed me," he said finally. "It made me feel small, ashamed. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I didn't like what it showed me, but I think it was showing me a chance, not just a flaw. A chance to be something other than what my father taught me to be." Poppy said nothing, but she smiled, and for the first time, Edmund smiled back at her. Not a sneer, not a mocking twist of the lips, but something small and genuine and new. In the days that followed, the village slowly began to rebuild. Neighbors who had never spoken beyond polite nods now worked side by side, clearing mud, repairing roofs, sharing what little they had. Grief and hardship, it turned out, had a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. Much as Poppy's mother had once warned, they could also harden them if one let them. Willow Cottage was among the worst damaged, its foundations weakened, its small store of winter provisions ruined by the floodwater. Poppy's mother tried to hide her worry, but Poppy could see it plainly now, even without the lantern's light. The crease between her eyebrows, the way she counted their remaining coins late at night by candlelight, murmuring numbers that never seemed to add up to enough. It was then that Silas Grimshaw returned to the village. He arrived not with his cart of trinkets, but alone, on horseback, his sharp eyes taking in the flood damage with something like satisfaction, as though hardship were simply an opportunity waiting to be harvested. He found Poppy at the riverbank, helping to fish waterlogged belongings from the mud, and dismounted with his oily smile firmly back in place.
"Ah, little miss.
I heard of the flood. Terrible business. Terrible." He did not sound particularly sorrowful. "I don't suppose your circumstances have changed your mind about that lantern of yours? I could offer 30 sovereigns now. Enough to rebuild your cottage twice over, I'd wager, and have coin left besides." Poppy looked at the lantern, which she now carried with her always, tucked safely in her bag. 30 sovereigns. It was an almost unimaginable sum for her family. She thought of her mother's worried counting, of the cracked foundation, of the long winter ahead with too little food and too little warmth. But she also thought of the flood night, of the clarity the lantern had given her, the lives it had perhaps helped save simply by clearing her frightened mind long enough to remember where help could be found. She thought of Edmund and the vision that had cracked open something long frozen in him. She thought of her mother's words, "A hard heart is a heavier thing to carry than an empty purse." "No," she said again, more firmly this time. "I won't sell it. Not for 30 sovereigns, not for 300. It isn't mine to sell, not really. It doesn't belong to me. It was given to me to use, not to trade away." Grimshaw's face darkened, the charming mask slipping further. "You're a foolish child, clinging to sentiment while your family starves in a broken house. Very well. But do not come crawling to me when winter takes what pride will not let you sell." He rode away, and this time, Poppy did not feel the same doubt she had felt before. She felt, instead, a quiet certainty settling in her chest, though she could not yet have explained why. That night, exhausted from the day's labor, Poppy sat by the fire, rebuilt now in a corner of the chapel where displaced families were sheltering together, and drew out the lantern one final time. She thought of the old woman's warning. The lantern does not simply give. It also asks. In time, it will ask something of you. "What do you want from me?" she asked softly, lighting the lantern's gentle golden glow. This time, the vision that unfolded before her was different from all the others. She saw the old woman from the riverbank, but younger, decades younger, standing at a crossroads much like the one Poppy now faced. She saw the old woman being offered gold for the very same lantern by a merchant much like Grimshaw, in a village much like Hollow Bridge, generations ago. She saw the old woman refuse, just as Poppy had. And she understood, in a wave of quiet clarity, that the lantern passed itself down not through inheritance or purchase, but through unbroken chains of chosen kindness, that every person who had carried it before her had faced this same test, this same temptation to trade truth for gold, and that the lantern's light only remained bright in the hands of those who chose, again and again, not to hoard its power or sell its worth, but to use it in service of others. The vision showed her one final thing, herself, years from now, an old woman on a dusty road, offering the lantern to another kind-hearted child in a village not yet built, in a story not yet written. The chain, unbroken, continuing onward. Poppy understood, then, what the lantern had truly been asking of her all along. Not simply to refuse gold, but to accept the responsibility of carrying truth gently, of using clarity not for her own gain but for the good of those around her, for as long as it was hers to carry, and then, one day, to pass it on freely, just as it had been given to her. She blew out the light, and for the first time since the flood, she slept peacefully. Winter came hard to Hollowbridge that year, as Grimshaw had warned it would. But something remarkable had happened in the village since the flood, something the merchant, with his ledger book heart, could never have predicted or understood. The village had learned, in its shared hardship, to lean on one another. Mr. Pratt, softened by his son's example and perhaps by some quiet shame of his own, forgave several months of rent for the families whose cottages had been damaged, including Willow Cottage. Mrs. Fenwick organized a rotation of shared meals, so that no family went hungry even when their own larders ran thin. The baker, Mr. Whitfield, whose grief the lantern had once shown Poppy, began leaving day-old bread at the chapel door each evening, not for coin, but simply because he had finally found, in the village's collective struggle, a way to let his sorrow become gentleness instead of gruffness. Edmund, much to his father's bemused consternation, took to spending his afternoons at the chapel, helping the younger children with their letters and sums, having discovered, quite by accident, on that first muddy morning of the flood, that he rather liked being useful, and that people looked at him differently, more warmly, when kindness rather than wealth was what he offered them. And Poppy herself became something of a quiet fixture in the village's healing, not because she boasted of the lantern or its powers, for she never told another soul its full truth, but because she had grown, through carrying it, into precisely the kind of person the old woman on the riverbank must have hoped she would become: steady, observant, generous with her time and her small store of wisdom, unafraid to sit beside grief or extend a hand to those the rest of the village overlooked. By the time spring returned to Hollowbridge and the river Aldwyn ran gentle and silver once more, Willow Cottage had been rebuilt, not grandly but soundly, with a roof that no longer sagged and walls that no longer let in the winter draft. Poppy's mother, though still not wealthy by any measure Silas Grimshaw would have recognized, no longer counted coins by candlelight with that worried crease between her brows. The village had given back to them, in shared labor and shared bread, far more than 30 gold sovereigns could ever have purchased. Years passed, as years do, gently, and then suddenly all at once. Poppy grew from a girl into a young woman, and though she left Hollowbridge for a time to see something of the wider world, she always returned, drawn back by the river and the hills and the people who had become, through hardship and kindness both, something like family beyond her own blood. She married, eventually, a quiet young carpenter from a neighboring village, and had children of her own, and grew into precisely the kind of woman other people brought their troubles to, not because she had grown wealthy or powerful, but because she had grown wise, in the particular way that comes only from choosing, again and again across a lifetime, kindness over convenience, truth over comfort, generosity over gain. She kept the lantern always, though she used its light more sparingly as the years went by, having learned that true clarity, once deeply understood, no longer always requires a lantern to summon it. She had, in her own heart, become something of a lantern herself, a source of quiet, steady truth for those around her. And then, one autumn afternoon many years later, walking along a riverbank not unlike the one where she had first met the old woman, Poppy, now gray-haired and travel-worn herself, for she had taken to wandering in her later years, teaching, helping, simply being present where she was needed, came upon a young girl sitting alone by the water, her clothes patched, her face troubled by some private sorrow. Poppy sat beside her, as the old woman had once sat beside a much younger Poppy, and they talked of small and unimportant things until the sun began to dip low over the hills. "You have shown me a kindness today, simply by staying," Poppy said at last, echoing words spoken to her a lifetime ago. "Kindness such as yours is rare, child, and rare things deserve to be rewarded." She drew the small brass lantern from her bag, tarnished now with the passage of many more years, its spiral patterns worn smooth by countless hands, and placed it gently in the surprised girl's palms. "Take this," she said. "It is called the Lantern of Truth. They say, in the villages along the river Aldwyn, that the Lantern of Truth still passes from hand to hand, generation upon generation, always finding its way to a heart generous enough to carry it without being changed by greed, and wise enough to use its light not for power, but for understanding. But the truth, the real truth, the one the lantern itself would surely illuminate, were it held up to its own story, is that the lantern was never really magic at all. Or rather, its magic was simply this, that when we choose kindness over gain, patience over pride, and generosity over greed, we begin to see the world, and the people in it, with a clarity that gold could never purchase. Poppy Hartley did not need a magical light to become the woman she became. She only needed to choose, on an ordinary autumn afternoon by an ordinary river, to share her blackberries with a hungry stranger, and then to keep choosing kindness, day after day, decision after decision, long after the shine of that first magical moment had faded into the steady, unremarkable business of simply being good. That, in the end, is the only lantern any of us truly need.